Hello, Consciously Parenting family, and welcome to the Conscious Coffee Break. I'm Jen Kobrick. I'm a holistic family consultant with the Consciously Parenting Project, and today we're talking about capacity. And this is another video where we're going to do a little reframe. So we tend to think of capacity as like a tank, right? So we have a tank, that's our capacity, and when it's drained, that's it. We're out of capacity. And so we're going to reframe that today a little bit and talk about why it might sometimes feel like you're operating on not much capacity and then somehow you dig deeper and you find something more and you manage to push through, and whether or not that's actually a helpful thing. So I'm going to reframe this to think about that our capacity is more like, let's say we have a tank in our car, a gas tank. And then let's say we have a reserve tank that the car can switch to automatically if the main tank runs out. And the reserve tank's smaller, but it's fairly easy to access. It happens automatically. And then let's say we have, maybe a 5-gallon gas can in the trunk or the boot of the car. And that's sort of the emergency reserve. And then let's say that we really like to have emergency reserves. And so we have a really small container of gas in the glove compartment. And so we've got several reserves, that are smaller and, progressively a little bit more of a hassle to use, but they're there if we need them. So now let's say that you're going on a long trip, and most people would agree that even if you have all these reserves, you probably want to stop for gas when there's still some gas in the main tank, right? You probably don't want to make a habit of using up the tank and the reserves and then limping to a gas station on the last little bit of gas in your glove compartment. And if you were doing that regularly, you'd probably, people would probably tell you that you're at risk for, ending up stranded on the side of the road with a car that won't run. So even though you have these reserves, you're mostly going to operate within the capacity of your main tank, ideally, right? So you're going to use up some of that fuel, and then you're going to stop and refuel and be going back and forth in that capacity. But if something happens and you were planning to stop for gas, and then it turns out that gas station you were planning to stop at is closed, and the next one is 20 miles down the road, and then you end up going into your reserve tank, you'll make it there, right? If your plan was that you were going to wait till the reserve tank was empty and stop for gas on the emergency tank, and then the gas station is closed and the next one's 20 miles down the road, you might not have enough reserves to get there, right? Then you might just run out of gas. And so our capacity to function is the same. Our capacity to function, ideally, when we're respecting our boundaries, when we're getting our own needs met, and the same is true for our children and all of the people in our lives, but when we're getting our needs met, when we're listening to our boundaries, when we're following the ebb and flow of our energy and of our needs, we operate within the capacity of that main tank. That's the space in which we're pretty well regulated. If something happens in that space, let's say your child knocks over a glass of milk and there's suddenly milk all over the kitchen floor, that's the space in which we're able to say, oops, let's put a lid on that cup next time, and here's a towel, will you help me wipe that up? And no big screaming, no big meltdown, and we move through things in the way that we intend to, in the way that feels connected and conscious and intentional. So then that first reserve tank is sort of like what we talk about as the yellow light, the space where we're kind of a little nervous, like, I'm kind of edgy and I don't really feel great, and maybe I'm clenching my jaw and making fists, and I'm kind of, but I'm still keeping it together. I'm not totally losing it, but I'm getting some pretty strong signals that I should maybe fill up the tank here. And if we continue to push past that and we get to the emergency tank, that's the space where we might run out of ability to cope, right? That's the space where we might just And we might end up in burnout. We might end up, unable to get out of bed. We might end up so completely exhausted that we can't function. We might find ourselves losing it, yelling at our kids, and, a glass of milk spills on the floor and we're screaming at them about how we do everything around here and they can't even be, they can't even help out by keeping their milk on the table, and how dare they? And, that kind of really big reaction, because we're so far outside of our capacity. And that also explains how, when we are generally operating within that fairly regulated place and we're generally getting our needs met, and then something happens that's outside of the normal day-to-day stuff, like a child gets sick and so suddenly they're up, 5 times in the middle of the night, and they've thrown up and we've got to change their sheets in the middle of the night, and we get, basically no sleep. And we're able to dig deep and still function the next day because we have those reserves. If we were already operating on reserves or on the emergency tank, and then a child gets sick and is up in the middle of the night and throws up and we get no sleep, then we're likely to have a really hard time the next day, or find that that's the breaking point. And so this came up recently with talking about that for some of us, we've spent many years sort of operating in that space of the reserves and, just barely filling up the tank enough to keep us out of the emergency tank, but not really, moving into that fully regulated space. And so that can come to feel like normal. That can come to feel like the normal thing is to sort of always be, on the edge of totally being out of gas. And moving back really into a place of having capacity is a process. That's not something that can happen overnight. It's a process of filling a little bit more than gets drained, and of looking for creative ways to listen to more of your own internal boundaries, and finding creative ways to work together with the people in your life, and connecting in community if necessary. If you don't have enough people in your life to support you in the ways that you need, to get the support and the resourcing needed to meet your needs and fill the tank, and getting creative about what can be let go of or handed off or changed in some way to reduce the demands. And it's a very slow process. It's not something that happens instantly. And so as we're thinking about this, if you're resonating with the idea of regularly feeling like you're at the edge of your capacity, and in order to function, you're having to push through to some kind of reserve, rather than functioning from a generally regulated, resourced, having enough capacity place, then start to try to notice what it feels like in your body when you're pushing through the things where it feels like you maybe would like to not push through, or what it feels like in your body when you're having to push through to that deeper level of resources in order to get through the day. And looking for those as indications that that's a boundary that needs to try to be respected. And then on the other side, looking for what it feels like when you're operating from more capacity and from more of a place of that this really feels good. And listening to that authentic yes as well. And if you could use some more help figuring out what that feels like, or if one of the things that would help get your needs met is having some space to be heard, and to be validated and to be listened to with compassion, then join a healing story circle. We have free healing story circles at consciouslyparenting.com/ support. I have a couple a month of free healing story circles, or come join us in the Consciously Parenting Community Facebook group, which is a free group. And if you really could use some more support than that, then reach out and we can connect you one-on-one. Because someone who can listen and hold that space for you and help you to process all of these experiences is definitely a big part of that resourcing piece of moving back towards being well within your capacity. So as always, have a wonderful week, and I will see you on the next Conscious Coffee Break.